Seb's Soapbox. Okay, hello, welcome to episode 4 of my Soapbox. Hopefully today without any of the promised technical difficulties. No promises. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. And then, yeah, let's dive right into it. So, well, it's still June. Still there. It's still Pride Month. So, first of all, happy Pride to all of y'all celebrating. Today, I want to talk about misconceptions about human sexuality across history, or why the statement that back in the day people were not as perverted as they are today is not quite the right way of thinking about these issues. Because literally everything else about human lives, human sexuality also has a history. And a history that changes over time, or rather, it changes over time. Human sexuality is not the same across time. That means there is a history. That means we can talk about these things as it pertains to the history of human sexuality. But it does not change over time in the ways that people might think. It doesn't mean that because we're now in the present, that is somehow uniquely perverted or something, that people in the past were less so, and that as time goes on, we become like more perverted or some nonsense like that. People in the past were just as horny and as sexually charged as we are today. They did, however, conceive of their own sexualities in ways that are different from the ways that we perceive of our sexualities today. And then there's also the big problem that the field of history as a discipline only really came of age in the Victorian era, which ended up with the morals of the Victorian era people overshadowing a lot of the deeper past for quite a long time. History as a specific field is relatively young and only began to take the shape it's in today in the early 19th century. Before that time, the field of history was generally more one of philosophical narrative. It was not as concerned with finding out what actually happened and documenting specifically the past in the way that historians have been doing it since then. It was not really concerned with sources. It was more concerned with, okay, yeah, well, then back in the day something happened that's kind of a parable for things that are happening today. But since this field of history, this field of intellectual inquiry took shape in the cultural and social context of the 19th century, historians and archaeologists who laid the foundations for the discipline infused many of those early findings with their own inherent biases, with the inherent biases of their time and of their own cultural contexts. And this is nowhere clearer than in the field of human sexuality, because the 19th century was in that regard a very peculiar time. And hold on to your butts, this gets a bit meta now. So, historian of sexuality Helen Lefkowitz Horowitz wrote in her Pulitzer Prize finalist 2003 work, Rereading Sex, about how the 19th century in America especially saw a lot of new research into human sexuality that was informed by Enlightenment ideas and by the overall thrust of the scientific revolution that was at the time kind of still in its later phases. And yes, the pun is honestly intended. I like that. But much of this new research then in the 19th century is informative of the sexual mores of those times, and as well as of the newfound repression of sexuality that was fueled in the United States by the Second Great Awakening. That was a religious movement that brought us things like the Mormons and the Seventh-day Adventists and so on and so forth. And research into sexuality in the early 19th century came out of a similar direction as other contemporary proto-anthropological research that we today understand as scientific racism, or medical research of the time that was going out to prove that miasma theory was actually a thing. And this was conducted by people, mostly men, who used new and scientific seeming methods to prove all kinds of theories born out of their own cultural contexts true. And so homosexuality, for example, here, or rather same-sex sexual activities, were in the 19th century literature on human sexuality generally portrayed as wrong and immoral, but ultimately as preferable to a much worse thing, and that was masturbation. Because 19th century sexologists were convinced that human beings had only so much nervous energy, and that having sex with another person gave this energy a place to go. It would go in a circle, basically, sort of, and be a wonderful thing. But if you had sex by yourself, that didn't happen, and you just spent that nervous energy, and it didn't go anywhere, and was really bad for you for some reason, and made you go insane, essentially. And so even in their view on homosexuality was that, well, it's not good, but at least there's someone else there that you're doing it with. And they also had kind of like interesting views on foreplay. So digital stimulation of a woman by a man, you're not doing that. You're just wasting her nervous energy, and that's just gonna make her hysterical, basically. So yeah, that's just as an illustration of where the scientific exploration of human sexuality was at during the time that the historical profession basically came of age. And this is where we need to start talking about deeper pasts. So deeper pasts in this sense means that the 19th century is the past, but there are deeper pasts than the 19th century. There's earlier times than the 19th century, and that's what I mean by deeper pasts. And we also have to talk about why it is important to consider who's writing history. For example, the history of archaeology knows several cases of couples that are buried together, and then after some research, people find out that those couples who are buried together and were considered, oh yeah, they're lovers, like man and a woman, they're lovers. Then people find out that, wait a minute, they're not man and a woman. Those are two of the same, right? And then reassessments start, where it's like, well, they're same-sex burials, so they must have been just good friends, just bros. Or if they're women, they were just, gal pals. Because, well, at the moment in time at which these graves were discovered were then ones during which people just had not, their minds could not accept that people in the past would have been, of that persuasion. And also these moments did not just happen in Victorian times, but also pretty close to present day. There's like cases in the 70s where in Iran or in Italy graves were discovered where same-sex burials, and they're just like, well, no, those guys or girls, they're not, like, those are not lovers, no, even though they're like very intimately intertwined in those graves, and it's kind of lovely. And then it's just like, no, they're not lovers, they must have been just friends. And this is what we historians call presentism. It's a sort of inherent bias that is quite persistent, especially when it comes to the history of sexuality. And there are many forms of presentisms that are involved in looking into human sexual expressions and experiences in the past. And here I should also add that I am personally not a historian of sexuality. I'm not particularly well-versed in gender studies. I'm just fascinated by the historic presentisms that these fields have to grapple with and go against. It bears repeating that the past is indeed a foreign country that in so many ways radically differs from the present, but since the past is perceived of as our past, we often believe that things in the present have been the way they are right now for much longer than they actually have. And historic presentisms are a particular conundrum. So what do we mean by presentism? Basically, in the way that French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault would phrase it, a presentism is when one writes history of the past in terms of one's present, as opposed to writing the history of the present. Does that make sense? And historical presentisms are when we in the present look back at histories that people in the past, that past historians wrote of their pasts in terms of their presence. Our head's spinning yet that's just what happens once Michel Foucault raises his bald noggin. Gender history and the history of sexuality specifically suffer from those presentisms, and many later historians have then to come in and clean up long-held misconceptions that come out of these past presentisms about deeper pasts that earlier historians got fundamentally wrong. Much of the history of the world before the 19th century suffered because of 19th century historians projecting their own socio-cultural contexts back onto earlier times. And then things get especially odd if we look at the history of homosexuality, as hinted at with the lovers' burials. Like pretty much everything else in the world, as I said in the beginning, homosexuality, or rather the concept of same-sex attraction, because homosexuality was not always called homosexuality, that is actually a fairly recent term, has a history. Same-sex attraction has a history. It's a thing that changes over time. This is somewhat difficult to wrap your head around. Our current idea of what homosexuality is and how this sexuality differs from heterosexuality is, as I said, pretty young. The idea that sexuality is, that there is such a thing as a sexual identity is pretty young. That has only really come up like in the last, I want to say like 70, 80 years maybe. And so that just mean, that doesn't mean that homosexual attraction did not exist before the present moment. It does not mean that homosexual attraction is only 80 years old. It just means that people in the past practiced and perceived of homosexuality or of homosexual attraction different than people do now. The ancient Greeks and the Romans had many other cultures around the world in the past and also in the present did not have the kind of conception of homosexuality in the way that we understand it here in the global north today. So there again is a danger of presentism, but this presentism is doubly inflected by past historical presentisms, but also by past oppressions. So as gender studies scholar Pamela Geller describes in her book Bioarchaeology of Socio-Sexual Lives, what we need here is an enlightened presentism that understands the past in its own terms. And we, both historians and the broad general public, need to understand that past and present have a relational connection, but not one that is progressive. And I'll talk about that more next week. The current moment is not the most advanced moment in history just because it is the latest moment in history. And this becomes extremely clear when we look at queer lives and cultures just across the 20th century. Historian George Chauncey wrote in his 1995 book, Gay New York, about the pre-World War I gay scene in New York City that for the most part has been forgotten today that ever was a thing. Chauncey explicitly states in his works, he's just was recently honored basically for all the work he's done on LGBT history. He explicitly states that his work aims to dispel a number of presentist misconceptions about gay life before the gay movement or the gay liberation movement of the 60s. Because homosexual subculture existed before, and this subculture was not isolated, and it was actually quite visible to the public. It was not really hidden. It was not closeted in the way that we would think of. And in New York, this gay subculture even attracted quite the non-gay audience, and like an approving audience that was like, hey, yeah, they're going to varieté shows, they're going to like travesty drag shows, basically, and that's just been largely forgotten about. And between the turn of the century and the 1930s, New York City had a vibrant gay scene. But the self-conception of the people that made up the scene would have been quite different from that of contemporary non-heterosexuals. Also, the pre-war gay subculture was much stronger integrated into mainstream society, simply because at the time there was not quite the distinction between homosexuals and heterosexuals. Again, those concepts are quite new, quite recent. And this strong, but due to the strength and the prevalence of these concepts, they seem like they are eternal things that have always been there in exactly this form, and they have not. They have not. People thought of themselves as in different ways in the past. Homosexual and heterosexual in the way that these terms are used today, and in the way that they constitute distinct and sharply delineated sexual identities, have not been understood in this way since about the 1930s. Correct me if I'm wrong there, by all means. As I said, I'm not really an expert on this thing. I'm just a well-informed kind of lay person from another field. But anyway, the pre-war gay world was essentially oppressed out of existence and to a large extent out of memory by social and political factors as the homo-hetero spectrum began to emerge as a fast concept, especially in American society. And as historian Margaret Kennedy writes in her 2009 study on the state-mandated regulation of homosexuality and sexual deviancy, the book is called The Straight State. This oppression began with the sexual mores of the progressive era, so between 1896 and 1916. And in this era, the state in the U.S. began turning away, for example, openly homosexual immigrants, because these people began to be understood as undesirable sexual deviants, because sexual deviancy, so anything that was not between a man and a woman, married men and women preferably, was seen as a personal failing. And a man, this is mostly about men, and a man who failed to rein in his own desires in this way was seen as unfit to govern himself, and seen that he would be likely to become a public charge and therefore unfit to live in the United States. Men who were in this way not self-governing in their sexual practices could not, it was assumed, could not be self-governing in their labor, and they were therefore seen as being unable to hold down paid work. And beyond this context of immigration, homosexuality in the U.S. was then increasingly criminalized from the 30s onward, also in reaction to the visibility of the gay scene that Chauncey described in New York. And what many of the people today who are gearing up for a genocide against trans people and getting murderized when drag shows are mentioned usually don't know or have forgotten about, what they don't know is that World War II actually saw quite a lot of gay GIs putting on drag shows for their fellow fighting men. Granted, these soldiers and sailors and airmen were not necessarily free from their own oppression within the armed forces, but during the war, quite a lot of GIs that served in the various theaters of war also served in the theater of entertainment for their fellow, fighting men. And it's World War II, so they were all fighting men. And since the armed forces at the time were this all-male affair, this meant that men put on female costumes and performed female roles. And that was not just a fringe phenomenon. Alan Berube writes in his book Coming Out Under Fire, The History of Gay Men and Women in World War II, that the Army Special Services headquarters even published the so-called blueprint specials that included dress patterns and other instructions for putting on drag routines. Sure, not everyone in the military was necessarily thrilled about those performances, but here we have the often glorified by the meatheads greatest generation enjoying drag shows while on pause from killing Nazis or Japanese. So drag shows are not a new phenomenon, and your grandpa was possibly in one. And then after the war in the 1950s, Senator McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee was trying to sniff out communists everywhere in the United States, but also the same people zeroed in on suspected homosexuals because, according to McCarthy, communists shared a mental deviancy with homosexuals, which made homosexuals especially suspicious. since being mentally twisted enough to have homosexual tendencies simply meant that one must have tendencies to also sympathize with communism. And hundreds of high-ranking government officials were purged from their roles, especially in the State Department at the time, in this so-called lavender scare. I had that wrong on Monday. It's the lavender scare, it's not the pink scare. The pink scare is, again, something different. Anyway, and this today has again been largely forgotten as a footnote of just general McCarthyism against the communists. And then after World War II, homosexuality was then again scandalized, more scandalized, with the increasing equation of homosexual deviancy with pedophilia. And this oppression and condemnation of the homosexual scene basically slammed them back into the closet. And that oppression essentially overshadowed the existence of the vibrant gay world that came before. And again, this is where we're getting at. It's buried under layers of history, and shows how one layer of history can obfuscate ones that came before that are deeper. And in many ways, these misconceptions act in similar ways to what David Wengroth and the late great David Graeber wrote about, or rather against. So they wrote against the early modern anthropological misconceptions about human civilization in their magnum opus, The Dawn of Everything, which all of you should read. So historical misconceptions about the past have been left unchallenged for long, and because they have been unchallenged for so long, they can be very difficult to dislodge. But if there is one thing to remember from this exercise, it's that our present is closely related to the past, but that thinking, culture, and understanding of oneself by past people was often vastly different from the way we do things today, and not necessarily as regressive in comparison as we might necessarily think. Tune in next week. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, etc., etc. And now I'm stepping back down from the soapbox.